All right, let's go ahead and get started. So thank you all very much for coming this morning. I know you have a choice of sessions to go to, and I also saw that Mark Rasinovich and John Papa are talking at the same time. Plus, I feel like I had to make the Kessel run to get up here. It's so far away from the main event downstairs, so I appreciate everybody coming today. My name is Chris Johnson, and today we're going to be talking about, it's really a session about a whole bunch of tips and tricks for creating apps with Office and with SharePoint. So I don't know about you, but I like sessions that are mostly demos. So pretty much for the next 60-odd minutes or so, we'll be doing anywhere from 8 or 9 demos or something along those lines, depending on how many questions you ask, covering a range of different topics. It's a real grab bag of different things. Mostly things that I've learned during app development for SharePoint and Office, using the new app model and so forth, and some handy sort of things that I would have liked to have known when I got started out building apps as well. So hands up first, who's building SharePoint apps with the new app model today? A few folks. Office? A couple of folks as well. Excellent. Who's totally new to the new app model in Office and SharePoint? Great, so that's, I'd definitely say the majority. So I have some slides, not very many, mostly just intros to each of the different demos that we'll be doing, and a couple of ancillary ones just to help set those up. But first, if you want to get in touch with me, my contact details are up on the slide. I blog at looselytyped.net, and I'm on Twitter on LoungeflyZ or LoungeflyZ, depending on where you come from. Some friends of mine, we recently released a book, Beginning SharePoint Development, for 2013, and it's available on the bookstore downstairs if you want to go and grab it. That book is jam-packed full of stuff about apps. That's really what we spend most of the time discussing. But get in touch with me on Twitter or via my blog if you have any questions. I'll be available in the Building Apps booth down in the Office Pavilion, down in the expo floor after the session. I think starting at around 12 o'clock I'm on there. So when I thought about the agenda, I was like, well, what do I want to cover? And really I just thought, wouldn't it be cool if we just did demos the whole hour? So I know this doesn't really give much insight into which demos we'll be doing, but we'll be covering all sorts of things from dealing with tokens and caching of security tokens and so forth as part of the app model, through to doing things like using SignalR for debugging and tracing of apps and Azure and so forth, all the way through to doing some bits and pieces with Office as well. So we really cover quite a range of topics. I like to keep things pretty informal, so I don't want you to necessarily wait until the end to ask questions. Just let me know, stick your hand up and sing out if I don't notice, and ask a question. Because we go through so many different demos, it's probably worth asking those questions during that section of the session rather than waiting for the end. So with that, let's get started. So demo number 1 is using SignalR for app tracing and debugging. Hands up anybody who knows what SignalR is. I'll take the inverse proportion of the room don't know what it is. So a little bit of an outline first before we jump into the demo. So SignalR is a framework and a set of tools that let you do really simple messaging between 2 points. For example, that could be between a phone and a service, or it could be between a service and a service, or it could be between a piece of JavaScript running in a browser and some service, say in Azure or the back end of your website. It's typically, or it was originally introduced and typically used for doing really nice, or giving you lots of options around user experience for web apps, in that it's great for being able to pass messages back and forth between the JavaScript running in your browser and code running on the server without having to do page refreshes and so forth. And if you've had to do this in the past, it's pretty tricky. And SignalR wraps it up in a really nice framework. You can grab it from NuGet and install it into your app. They do libraries for all sorts of different project types. And it makes it really simple to pass messages and back and forth between 2 places. I actually prefer it for non sort of business critical message passing. I sort of prefer it than service bus. Seems a little lighter weight and easier to set up for me anyway. So with that, let's jump into the demo. Let me just, my machine logged out for a second. Okay. All right, so here we have a pretty vanilla SharePoint Online developer site. If you haven't got a 365 developer tenancy yet, you can go and sign up and grab a free trial, and it'll provision an Office 365 tenant for you. And then as part of that template, they give you a developer site ready to go. And this gives you sort of links to all the right places to go and build, to get the tools to build apps, links to go and submit apps and so forth to the store. Now, the only caveat with that is that the submission to the store requires a paid 365 tenancy now, so as it's moved out of preview. So when you want to go and submit apps and go and make millions from everybody using Office 365, then you need a paid 365 subscription to submit them. But this is basically a great starting point for building apps. You want to get yourself a 365 tenancy that you can start using for building apps, deploying apps to, and debugging apps. And the Visual Studio tools, if you didn't go to the 0 to 60 getting started with SharePoint app development session, I highly recommend taking a look at the video for that session. That talks about all of that sort of basic setup stuff to get you up and running. But Visual Studio does a great job of connecting to your Office 365 tenant and deploying apps for you as you want to debug them and wiring them up so that you can run code on your local dev box, but then have the app deployed into your 365 tenant. Okay, so with that said, Signal R. So what I wanted to do is build a really simple little app. And really it's just a bare bones app. All it does is when you visit the app, it runs some code in the background of a page creation. And it's a provider-hosted app. So the back-end code will ultimately run in Azure, but for the purposes of the demo, I'm just running at F5 on my local machine. When I do F5, it deploys the app up into the Office 365 tenancy here. It runs the web project on my local machine. And so when I use the app in my 365 tenancy, it hits the locally running back-end process of the app. So we can do debug points and all that sort of stuff. Breakpoints, sorry. All those sorts of things. So what's going to happen is when we hit the page in the app, all it's really going to do is run some code behind that page, which I said would run in Azure, and it's going to use Signal R to do some debug and tracing output. So first I just want to walk through the solution and show you a little bit about what it will do, and then we'll see it in action. So let me flip over here to, this project is called My Basic SharePoint App for a reason. It's pretty straightforward. Consists of two projects, the SharePoint app project itself, and if you open up the app manifest file, you'll see here that the hosting type down the bottom there is set to provider hosted, so that means it has that code-based backend. And that code-based backend is signified with the second project, the app web project, and this contains all of my code and so forth. So when I run this app, what happens is, if you look in the app manifest again, if you take a look at the start page attribute, that's the page that's going to be kicked off when somebody clicks through to this app from SharePoint Online. They're going to come to this default.aspx page. And that page exists over in my other project here, in the pages directory. Don't worry about these other files for now. They're associated with other parts of other demos. But default.aspx is very simple. It simply has a hyperlink to this page called monitor.aspx, which I'll show you in a moment. It's very untrendy, this page. It doesn't look any good. And then the back end of that page, or the code behind, has some code in it to reach into SharePoint and grab the title of the web that the app is running on. In this case, that's the developer site. So the title of it was called developer site, I think it was. And it's going to retrieve that property from SharePoint and then just display it on the page. And we know that our app is run. So I'm not going to walk through in great detail all of these pieces of code just yet. The one line of code I do want to talk about is that last line called tracecaster.cast. So tracecaster is a little helper class that I've added to my project, and it has a cast method on it. And all that does is, it's not casting in the object sense of the word, it's casting like broadcasting a message out. And so really all I'm doing is formatting a message with the title of the web that it's retrieved and the URL. And it's broadcasting it out to whoever's listening. And so you can imagine that monitor page that I just spoke about, that's going to be where we're going to see these messages. That's one of our listeners. But in SignalR, you can have multiple listeners. It could be phone applications, it could be web applications, it could be Windows applications. The choice is sort of endless there. And so whoever's listening for these messages will pick those up and be able to do something with them. And so in this particular demo's case, monitor.aspx is going to be my client listener. And we'll take a look at that in a moment. So if I take a look at tracecaster.cast, this is pretty straightforward. Oh, by the way, to get SignalR, just jump into NuGet packages, and you'll see SignalR core components, the JavaScript client if you're doing web things and so forth. You can grab them all up from NuGet, real simple to get all the dependencies you need. Now let's take a look at tracecaster. So this is a very simple file, very simple class. It really does two things. It defines a hub context statically. So a hub in SignalR is kind of like a chat room, right? When you go into a chat room and you type something in and you hit send, it goes to that particular room that broadcasts it out to everybody else that's listening. Very, very similar. Then the cast method, so a hub is what people will connect to say, I want to listen to events from this particular hub. And you can have multiple of those, obviously. So the cast just takes the message and broadcasts it to all clients that are listening. Now, the add message method on the end is a dynamic method. And this is the method that you want to call on the client when the message is received. So in our case, on the monitor page, we have some JavaScript that gets fired when a new message arrives, and it calls that method and does something with the message. So let's take a look at that monitor page and see what that's all about. There's no code behind the monitor page, it's simply JavaScript at this point. So to get this stuff running on a web page with SignalR, there are some dependencies. You've got to throw a few script tags on there for jQuery, SignalR, and so forth. And those get added to your scripts directory. The last one here is really interesting. So this /SignalR/hubs, you'll notice there isn't a SignalR directory in my project specifically, but this is a path that gets set up by SignalR. And so in your global ASAX file, it does some SignalR adds its hubs in the right place to the root map and so forth, so it knows where to get that path. But the real guts of this page is in the JavaScript that fires. So what happens here is when that add message method is called, this simple JavaScript gets called. And so in our case, or in my case, all I'm really doing is grabbing the date that the message came in and adding it to a list of message output on the web page. And then it also has a text box and a button where I can broadcast back from the page as well to anybody else that's listening. Kind of similar. I use it for testing just to make sure everything's wired up correctly. And the rest of the goo on this page is really, I can't believe how impossible it is to format dates in JavaScript. I don't know about you, but it blew my mind trying to do that. Okay, so let's get this started. So I'll click F5 to deploy. So in the background, if you notice down the bottom left-hand side, deploy started. So Visual Studio is taking the SharePoint application package, packaging it up, deploying it into the SharePoint Online tenancy, and starting the app. No, my app is pretty simple here. It's just a page with no branding, nothing really on it except a link to that monitor page. So what I'm going to do here is open that guy up in a new window. And if I snap that left and snap that right, there's my broadcast window my broadcast button on the right-hand side. I can type in there like, hello world. And when I click broadcast, I just get that echo back. So that's a good way for me to know that my hub is working correctly and it's receiving messages and sending them back out. So what I like to use this for is in my projects that I want to ultimately deploy to Azure, is I hate feeling like I'm sort of running in the dark with a pair of scissors. And Azure provides some interesting tracing and debugging features where you can log and debug, trace information and so forth. But I don't find the tooling very straightforward to use. and I like to know what's happening in my app in real time. And so what I like to do is replace it with sending these messages out to a SignalR hub where I can come to a page in my Azure app and see exactly what's going on in my application in real time in production, either in production or in stage, but running up in Azure. Okay, so we've done broadcast hello world. My hub is running. Now, in the app on the left-hand side, let me just jump back out to SharePoint. I'll refresh this page. Now, you notice when we fire off the app, we should get some debug output on the right-hand side. So my basic SharePoint app here is shown. If I click on that, that's just simply going to launch the app. And then over on the right-hand side, you can see we've got some trace output. So app access, the SharePoint Online site, developer site at that particular URL. So I like to intersperse this all through my apps and capture what's going on inside them. And in some of the subsequent demos, you'll see some more trace output that we add to help us see what's going on inside the app as we go through it. But I think that's really handy. I've done things in the past, like create a little Windows Phone app to listen to these things and monitor output from a back end of a Azure service that I have running that powers a phone app that I have in the store. And so I can see what people are doing with the app and on the back end of the service, make sure it's all up and running and so forth from wherever I am. It's really handy. Okay. Any questions on SignalR? Very, very cool, handy library. I love using it also for communicating between worker roles and web roles and web roles and worker roles and Azure websites. So it's not purely just a client-server style technology. I use it for talking between a worker role that might be doing some sort of ongoing process and maybe a web role that's serving a website, for example. Very handy there. Okay, so number 2 is caching tokens if you need to. So if you're not familiar with how SharePoint apps work in the new app model, when you launch an application from SharePoint Online to a provider-hosted app or an auto-hosted app, then it passes along a set of information that go with it. So for example, the site that the person was using in SharePoint, it has some context token information about who the person is and that it's been signed by SharePoint, so you know that the token that's being passed is valid and so forth, and it tells you a little bit about who they are and how to get access back into SharePoint to pull out data through the remote APIs and so forth. But that information is only passed the first time an app is called. So when you go to that default.aspx page, it actually hops through, there's 2 steps involved in launching an application. The first step that you may or may not even see in your browser is it goes to an app redirect page in SharePoint. And that page is responsible for getting all of that information, packing it all up, and then redirecting the browser to your application, passing along all of those pieces of information. But like I said, it only does that the first time. So what you want to do in your app is, if you need to, of course, keep that information for some period of time. You can obviously discard it if you don't need to, if you're just doing a one-off thing. But typically, applications have multiple pages. And so the second page in your app, if you have a link from your first page to your second page in the app, you'll lose that information unless you cache it somewhere or pass it across to that second page yourself. SharePoint doesn't do anything magical there for you. Now, also, in the tokens that are passed, there are a few different pieces of information. But there's a couple of really important security tokens that you need to be able to get back to SharePoint via the remote APIs if you want to. So, for example, to query a list and get some list data out. And so it's important in your second page, if you want to do that, then you need to cache some of those tokens. So there are a couple of techniques I like to use to do that. And so we'll switch back over to my demo machine here and take a look at that. Okay. So let's go back to my basic app, and let's take a look at default.aspx, because this guy is the first page that gets called. Actually, before that, let's jump back into the manifest real quick and take a look at this query string property down on the bottom. You see how it's got curly bracket standard tokens? That's the query string that is passed when your app is launched. And that's a magic token that SharePoint replaces with all of the pieces of information your app will need. So if your app doesn't have that in there, you can go put curly bracket standard tokens in there and you'll get the information passed via both the query string and also you get the context token through a post variable as well. Okay, so that's the app manifest. That's how you get the information passed to your app. And then if we take a look at in default.aspx.cs, we'll take a look at the code that we saw from the first demo in a little bit more detail. So I've got a helper. I've got a few helper classes to help me with this caching. I've got this thing called SP session context. It's just an object that I instantiate, and then I say build it from the context. And really, all that does is go through and pull out all of those parameters and put them into variables for keeping. And then also, I've got this SP token cache helper dot current session context. And so what that does is it takes that session context object. It does two things with it. One, it sticks it in a session state, and the second thing is it sticks it in ASP.NET caching as well. I do it in two places for a variety of different reasons I'll talk about in a minute. But if we take a look at the SP session context and jump into that and take a look at what it's doing, it's pretty straightforward. So these are the parameters that you get passed on the query string. So SP host URL, that's the URL to your SharePoint site that the app was launched from. Product number is like the version, so forth. You get information about language, and you also get a tag, like an E tag to ensure you don't have any weird caching issues. Then build from context really just takes the HTTP context, extracts those parameters out off the query string, and then grabs the context token. Now the context token is it's passed as a post parameter, and then Microsoft provide tokenhelper.cs, which I've also added to my project. That's part of the standard template that you get in a SharePoint app project. And this helps you deal with these context tokens. And so one of the methods on that token helper is get context token from request. So you pass it the request, and it will get you back the context token from it. And then another method that you can use is read and validate context token. And so that will basically validate that token that's passed across, and it'll throw a message, an exception if it's if it's not signed correctly or if it's invalid or that sort of thing. And so I stash that context token as well, because that's what you need to be able to call back to SharePoint. It's actually a base64 piece of JSON. So if you're that way inclined and want to get a little nerdy, then when it comes in and you see the context token, you can grab it. It's just a string, base64 encoded. You can go to base64decode.org, I think. Real handy little website. Paste it in, and you can see the JSON that it consists of. Unless somebody's going to make me, I don't think we'll do that. And then we basically stash that in session state. So back here where I said current session context, let's go take a look at that. The set just adds it to the cache and then adds it to session state. And adding it to the cache, there's a couple of really interesting things here. The first is that the context token gives you a cache key. So on the context token object, you get this .cache key property. And that's a property that's made up of a few different things that SharePoint issues so that you can use it as a key for whatever caching mechanism you want. And that won't change. So you're able to look it back up and that sort of thing. So I use the cache key to index it. I use the SP context as the object I want to stash. The context token also has an expiry. So the valid2 is the date time that you can use to expire this context token. By default, context tokens last 12 hours. So if you stash it and cache it, then you can keep using that token in the background even without user interactivity. So if you've, for example, got a worker role that wants to do things in your SharePoint site on that user's behalf, then you can use that context token to call using the client-side object model back into SharePoint for up to 12 hours. Now, there's one other interesting property in that context token. It's called a refresh token. And so a refresh token is valid for 6 months. And if you keep the refresh token, then you can get more access tokens to get back into SharePoint for up to 6 months. So your first context token lasts 12 hours. Your refresh token lasts 6 months. And you use it to get access tokens when you need them. Okay, so now it's in the cache. And so what we can do now is on our default.aspx page, I just want to uncomment this line, another hyperlink, which is to, in my incredibly genius moment, called it some other page. And if we go take a look at that some other page, it has pretty much nothing in it except in the code behind, where I'm going to use the client-side object model to go get that same web's title again from SharePoint. However, you'll notice that the client context, instead of trying to extract it and build it on the fly from the parameters that are passed, because they're not passed, in this case it'll be the second page in our app, we're going to lose all those get parameters and so forth off the query string. Then I'm going to use my cache helper to go and grab the current session context. And if we scoot over here, we could say just get client context, and it'll go and grab it for us from session state. And then we can use it to do things. So that current session context method or property goes and gets it from session, and we're able to use it to go and get on the session context object. You'll notice there's one final method called getClientContext, and this is really just a helper function that creates the client context object for the client-side object model. And so the way we do that is first we get an access token using the token helper, and we use the context token that we've stashed in our cache, and we use the SP host URL that we've also got, and we create an access token, and then we can say token helper.getClientContext with access token, and it does all sort of the magic behind the scenes to go and create a client context for us. And so then that makes the code real simple. We just want to say, I want to load the web and the title and the URL for that web, and this will be the title of the site. And then I want to go and execute that query and just write it out to the screen. So now let's go take a look at that. So if I hit F5, we're deploying successfully. My app should start up. We should see some other page, another page here. Let's also fire up, actually one thing I wanted to do that I didn't is uncomment something before we do that. So you'll see we've got retrieved down here. Also in our cache helper, I'm just going to uncomment that line of code, which will be another cast statement to just show the token that was added to the cache in the monitor window when we run. So now let me try that again. So I'll start that up. Okay, so let's grab the monitor over in another window. Make sure that guy's going. Everything's cool there. Let's go to some other page. Now, one other thing to notice before we do that, if you take a look at the query string, I know it's kind of hard to see in here. There are some parameters that are passed. Let me see if I can zoom in on that. There are parameters passed like SP host URL, and there's a whole slew of them passed on the query string there. So you can take a look at those. You won't see the context token. That's passed as a post. The other thing to note is that SharePoint will only post those things to HTTPS endpoints. So you have to be running an HTTPS, so you won't see it pop up in your page, but you will see it pop through in the post params on that for the code behind for that page. Now, if we go to another page here and click that, you'll see our request came in. It retrieved the title called developer site, and for some reason I didn't get a add to cache. That's very odd. Sorry? I've already added it to the cache. There you go. Good call. Do you want to come up here and help? Because I was behind on that one. Thank you. So let's go launch the app again and go see that thing get added to cache. I'm not actually particularly smart. in this app, not in general, I don't check if I've already added something to the cache. I just keep adding it to the cache regardless to update it. So let's go and say my basic SharePoint app again, and then you can go see we've added this token to the token cache. And this is the cache key. So you'll see it's got a few bits and pieces in it. But that doesn't change, like I said, and so you can use it to key off and so forth. You can also see the valid to date and so forth. And the audience is a couple of GUIDs based on your app and your tenant in SharePoint. So we can see that the cache has been added. We can go to another page. We've still got access to our client context. We can still make calls to SharePoint really straightforwardly. And we've got all of the goodness that comes in the token context with the refresh tokens to start being smart in the background about refreshing them if I need to keep context for up to 6 months. Post 6 months, you still need somebody to click your app and generate a new context token that you can then cache again, but you should be good for 6 months. So if you go store these in a database or something like that, you can come back to them and grab that refresh token, get access tokens from it, and away you go. Okay, so that's caching tokens. Let's see, what's next? Using OAuth to access SharePoint from Office. So Office apps, if you're not familiar with them, there are a couple of different varieties, but there's one called a task pane application that we're going to look at today, which is, what you'd expect is a task pane on the right-hand side. In this case, it's Excel, where it loads your app. And what it is really it's an embedded frame of IE that goes into Office, and so your app you could be served from Azure, for example, in that case, the example, we're going to use that case, so our website's going to drive those pages. But what I want to do is, from Office, from one of those apps, I want to get some data from SharePoint. So it could be a SharePoint list or something along those lines. My example's super simple. Again, it's grabbing that title of the site. Now, this is a little different because you're not launching your app from SharePoint. So when you launch an app from SharePoint, you get all the security context and everything passed with it. But when you launch an app in Office, you're launching it from an IE window embedded in your Office client application. And all of that goo is not passed with it. So what you need to do is, what I'm going to show you how to do, is to do what's called on-the-fly OAuth. And what this does is, what you're going to see happen is your app's going to launch in Office. The app window is going to use some JavaScript to pop a dialog that's going to go through the OAuth flow of SharePoint to get trusted by SharePoint. It's going to ask for some access to SharePoint data. The user has to, maybe sign into SharePoint and click trust it or accept or that sort of thing as part of the flow. Then what happens in the background is SharePoint then passes back a code back to the app. And in our case, it drops it on a page. We grab it in JavaScript, and then we use that code to go and reach back in, grab an access token, and reach back into SharePoint to get the data. So this is what's called on-the-fly OAuth, and it's not necessarily strictly needed or only strictly needed for Office apps. You can do this with SharePoint apps as well. A good scenario for that is when your app needs some extra permissions to things in SharePoint it doesn't have access to. And so you can, if the user is interactive in your application, you can send them through this OAuth flow in the SharePoint app as well to request more permissions. And that could be something only temporarily, or just you need to get. This app needs access to this magical document library that it shouldn't normally have access to. So it's applicable in both scenarios. So let's take a look at this thing in action. This one's a little kooky to keep up with because there's. I'm not the greatest JavaScript guy in the world, and there's a few different pages and a few different callbacks and a few different things to keep up with. So So let's take a look. In my solution, I've got a third project called My Excel Task Pane app. And so that's the app for Office. It's a real simple one. If we take a look at what's in there, it's pretty much nothing. If you look in the XML, it basically just gives it the source location for the task pane that you want to start when the app fires off. And so you've got a little remote app URL that gets replaced with the actual location of your app at runtime. When Visual Studio packages it all up. And then it's going to call /app/URL constructor.aspx. Now what this guy does, really all this page does is fire off that OAuth flow. So there isn't really much of a user experience in it other than it says redirecting in the page. So if we go take a look at that page, it's often my basic SharePoint app. And in the app directory, URL constructor.aspx. Keeping it simple, there's really only one thing you need to be, or one major thing you need to be aware of here. All I'm calling is some JavaScript off in this URL constructor.js file, and declaring a function in here that's going to be called by some JavaScript in that file. So if we take a look at that file, what it does is when the app initializes, so office.initialize, that will get called when Office has initialized your app, or getting ready to initialize your app, and it says basically go initialize yourself. What I do is call getClientID. It's a function call that, if you were paying attention, was back on this page here, called getClientID. And this really just declares a variable that I grab my client ID from my app settings. So that's defined in my web config file. You can see the client ID. And so the way SharePoint and OAuth works to SharePoint is you have the client ID in secret. It's the OAuth 2 standard, and so you can use those to as part of the OAuth flow to indicate who you are and that you're the right app and that sort of thing. But we need the client ID because we need to pass it to SharePoint to say, I want you to do some more OAuth for this user, for the current user for this particular app. And so our client ID is kind of like our app ID. I often call it app ID. And then we call the generate URL with that client ID. It's just a GUID, as you saw. So back in generate URL, this is one that creates the OAuth URL. And this is a URL that we are going to redirect the user to in a little dialog window to do the OAuth flow. And so really, all we're doing is sending them to _layouts, WAC15, WAC OAuth authorized.aspx. That's the endpoint or the URL for where you want to send them to ask for OAuth permissions. You say there's some parameters you can set, like your client ID, I've got to pass the scope, which is really the permission that you're asking for. In this case, I want to say I would like to be able to read information out of the web. And then the response type, I want to get a code back. And then the redirect URI, this is where at the end of the OAuth flow, where they're going to send the code to, where SharePoint will send the code to. So in our case, we've got another page called post_OAuth.aspx, and a query string parameter will get attached to that, which is the code that SharePoint, if they've correctly authenticated and trusted the app with those permissions, will get a code sent back to that OAuth, post-OAuth page. And so in there, what we do is we grab the code off the query string and we put the code into a value on this page. And if we look in the page here, we've got a hidden value called auth code. And so the code is going to go on that page. Now, the reason it's done like this is because the app code is running in Excel, in IE. It pops that dialog. They go through the dialog flow or the OAuth flow. They click trust. If they're successful, they get that code put into a hidden field on the post-OAuth page. And so now we've got the code on a separate page, and we've got the app running, and we use the JavaScript to reach into that page, grab the code out, and then continue. So let's take a look at how this goes, how this runs. Let me set a couple of breakpoints here. So I've got back here on, let's see, where do we want to do this? URL, no, post OAuth, I think we'll do it. We'll make sure we've got a breakpoint set there. Yeah, it's cool. We'll grab that. And then finally, default.aspx is our main end location for our app. And on that page, all I've put is default bang, so we know we're on it, and a field which I replace with, it says text code, but it's actually going to be the title of the site. And so the code behind for that, real simple. It grabs that code off the query string and makes up the client context and goes and grabs it from SharePoint, similar to what we did last time. It also does a little trace caster here as well. Now, what I need to do just before we move on is set up my startup project so that Excel app will start. So now I've got all three projects will begin when I hit F5. And if I hit F5, it's inevitable that with this many demos in a session that one of them isn't going to work. And if there is one of them that's not going to work, it's probably going to be this one. Just because it seems to like to toy with me from time to time. Okay, so let's just get set up here before we continue. So we've got working on it. Let's grab our monitor page, open that guy in a new window, put that over on the right, make sure it's going, everything's cool. You'll notice it launched Excel. So over on the right-hand side, you can see this redirecting in here. That is our Office app. That's our page that's really just got that JavaScript that fires off the OAuth flow. And you also notice the other thing that, or you may have noticed the other thing that had happened was pop up a dialog or pop up a window in this case. I'm not being particularly fancy about this. You can do all sorts of snazzies to make this really slick. But it's starting that OAuth flow. So I need to sign in. So let me type this in. My developer tenant is often somewhere like that. I think that's right. Click sign in. So the next step is asking for the permissions that app is asking for. And so it's asking for read permissions on this site and get basic information about the users of it. So really it's just reading info, which was that web.read permission I'm asking for. Now when I click trust it, what's going to happen is it's all going to happen pretty quick, but it ends up posting that code back to the dialog page. The dialog page goes, oh, look, I've got a code. The app reaches in it, grabs it, closes the dialog, and then calls SharePoint. So when we click trust it, the dialog disappeared, the code got posted back to back to our app. The breakpoint got hit in the back end. If we take a look at the code that came through, it's this guy, a big sort of gobbledygook piece of mess. And then we can use that. So I put that back onto our page in our hidden field. There's JavaScript in the background checking that field for a code. It sees one's arrived, it grabs it, and it sends it to this default.aspx page, passing it on the query string. So now when we go, let's go F10, you can see we've got the code. Our target URL is my developer site. I want to grab the realm and the URI because I'm going to use client token helper get client context with authorized code. So this is another method on the token helper that lets you get one of those tokens from the authorized flow and get a client context from it using that code. So let's just step through that. So I get a client context. I want to load up the web, the title. I want to execute the query. And I want to set the title of the web, which is developer site, back to our app front end. And so over on the right-hand side, we've got a little Excel app that on the fly asked for permissions from SharePoint, got them, and then got the code, used the client context to reach back in on the fly. So that's pretty cool. I quite like that, being able to add stuff to Office like that.
Quick question.
Go ahead.
What was it that you did that kicked off Excel and started it? Was it just a link to the file, or what was it?
Oh, right. So how did Excel start?
Yeah.
So when you create an app for Office, using Visual Studio, it will set all of that up for you. But what I wanted to do is, because I've got one solution with multiple projects, and I didn't want, in the first couple of demos, I didn't want the Excel app starting, so I just turned it off in the set startup projects. So this lets you define what's going to happen when you hit F5, what projects to start debugging. And so I just set that to none, or set it to start to get the Excel app.
I thought you did something
No, Visual Studio will fire up Excel and get all of that stuff wired up for you when you're using it for an Office app. Okay. So that's on-the-fly OAuth for Office. Like I said, you can also do it for SharePoint. Obviously, the Excel app doesn't start, but you can use it in your own app for things like grabbing additional permissions you might need. Okay, number 3 and 4. I call this 3 and 4 because there's kind of two parts to this demo. Using the SharePoint cross-domain library. So if you do a SharePoint app, and that when that app runs, you'll notice code that runs on the client side of that app runs on a different domain. And the reason it's done like that is to stop some nasty cross-site JavaScript problems that you have otherwise. So for example, an app that you didn't want to get access to certain things would be able to use JavaScript to reach into any part of SharePoint and screen scrape effectively, or call any services. And cross-domain scripting browsers implement preventions now to stop that from happening. So what we do with an app is it runs on a separate domain. And when you notice when you deploy an app into SharePoint Online and you go to that app, you'll get a funky GUID in the URL. And that's SharePoint Online creating a new app web for you and putting it on a special domain. So that means any JavaScript that runs in your app can't necessarily get access outside of that domain to other services or SharePoint itself and so forth, other than to its own app web, right? So when an app runs or when you install an app, it creates a separate app web, and you can put things in that app web like lists and libraries and do all that sort of stuff, and you can store data in it, and that's all totally kosher to go and use and push and pull information from using. There's no cross-domain issues there because it's where your app is running. But most people want to get access to stuff that's in the host web, which is the SharePoint site that you installed the app on. So for example, to get access to list data, for example. And doing that, you have to go cross-domain to get it. And so there's a couple of techniques to do to use that. The other scenario that I'm going to show you is when you've got an app that wants to reach out to another service that it can't necessarily get access to for whatever reason. And SharePoint provides a couple of helper techniques to get around both of these types of problems. So the two that we're going to cover is getting access to an external feed. In my case, it's just going to be the RSS feed from my blog in the app and show it. And then the second is reaching back into the second part of this demo is reaching back into SharePoint, into the host web, to go and get a list of information. So let's take a look at those two. So let's switch projects. Let me just clear up from my last thing here. Too many windows. All right, let's go cross-domain app. So this is a SharePoint-hosted app. There's no back end. There's no server-side code that runs. This is just HTML and JavaScript. And there's a couple of sections in here. The pages library, the default page is real simple. All it does is include some JavaScript libraries, jQuery and so forth, style sheet, and then it uses app.js, which is where all my application's JavaScript is. You'll notice this is pretty much out of the box. So when you create a new SharePoint app, then you'll see files just like this. I haven't had to write all this. So let's go take a look at the script file, app.js, which is really where all the rest of this demo happens. The first function runs when the document is ready, and so that gives us a point to kick off. Now, the first demo I want to show you is what happens out of the box with some JavaScript when I try and go and get my RSS feed from my blog. So I call this method called getFeedXDomain, and if I go to that, all it's doing is trying to do an AJAX call using jQuery to this looselytyped.net/feed URL. And if I take a look at that, all that is the RSS from my blog. All right? So that's what we want to try and get access to. And then when it's successful, or if it's successful, it calls parseXML. And that function just grabs the data, uses parseXML function, again, of jQuery, and then iterates through all the items and posts the title back to the page. So the goal here is all I want to do is get a list of the blog posts from that feed. So let's run this and see what happens. Any guesses? I've got prizes. Yeah, sort of. I'm using Chrome, so it doesn't pop up a great big box. But so the right answer was it doesn't work. And the reason is because it's trying to do cross-domain. So let's take a look at that page. It says it's initializing, but nothing else on the page. If we go take a look in the dev tools in the console, you can see we've got this error message down here. Cannot load loosely typed.net feed, and it was, because of access rules. So that request was blocked. So how do we get around that? So let's jump to the second part, to the next part of this demo. Let me comment that out and do it a slightly different way. So get feed via SharePoint proxy. That's a different function that it does kind of what it is titled. It uses what's called the SharePoint web proxy or the web proxy to make a call on your behalf. So instead of trying to talk to looselytyped.net, we're talking to SharePoint and saying, hey, could you go get this data from this other feed from this URL I've given you, and then proxy it back to me. So it's kind of acting like a little bit like a reverse proxy, if you want. But it's cool because it's running on the same domain your app is, and so you don't have the cross-domain scripting problems. And so the way you do that is you create a web request info object. You set the the URL and the method that you want to call. Then you set the context to say, hey, when I want to do this cross-domain request via my SharePoint context, and so that's the one that you get passed as an app, and so it will proxy it through that. I see I'm fetching data, I execute the query, and when I'm successful, I come down into this method and parse the data. So that will just pop the titles out on the page. Now when we run that, we should get something a little different. You see our blog posts on the page. So no errors as far as I'm aware, and we didn't get blocked by cross-site scripting in the browser. So that makes it really easy to reach out and go grab other pieces of information from external services and so forth, which is very, very handy. One other tip, actually I don't sort of mention this in the slides at all, but when you're running a SharePoint hosted app, you don't have to stop debugging to change stuff. So if you're not aware of this, you can just jump back into Visual Studio, cruise back up to here and say, I want to move on to the next part of my demo, comment that out, comment this in, hit Control S, and if you watch in the bottom left of the side of the window, it says communicating with SharePoint. And as soon as you hit save, Visual Studio is monitoring your files, and it will grab them and save them back up to SharePoint on the fly. And so I'm still debugging. Okay, so the second part of the demo is that's how you get access to an external service. But what about getting access to the host web, which is what we want to do in the second part of the demo. So what I need to do is load some script from that site. And so what I do is I create I create a URL to the scripts I need, to the sp.runtime.js and sp.js, based on the host web URL. And then I call getScript, which is going to load those scripts on demand from that web. And I want to, when I'm done loading those scripts, the important one is at the end, and the reason I nested is to do them in the right order, is request_executor.js. And so this has the helper methods and objects and so forth that we're going to use in this next function, called getDocuments and host_app. So if I go through to that and take a look at what it does, it's kind of similar to what we saw in the first demo with getting the external data. Slightly different. What we do is we create the app web context that we need. We create a proxy web request executor factory, which somebody must have been on crack when they dreamt that name up. And then we associate them. And then we say, I want to get a context for the host web. And so that's the client context that we're going to use the client-side object model on to reach back in and grab a list of documents out of that document library. So we associate the two, and we give it the URL of the host web. And again, that is passed to you on one of those get parameters. Then we want to say I want to get the web, I want to get the list called documents. I just want to get everything. I'm not doing a camel query being passed with that, and I want to load it all. And I want to include the title and the field ref attributes from those items. We're not going to use field ref in this particular demo. I do that next. And then we execute the query. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to create a client context, that host web context that's going to get created for me, or that I've asked for. There's going to be the context for that host web, and then I can execute queries on it that will run. Now, in the background, you can take a look on MSDN for a deep analysis of how this all works under the covers. But there's a whole series of things like hidden iframes and so forth that help make all this stuff work under the covers. So I suggest if you want to know how these helpers are doing their work, you could take a look in the JavaScript libraries themselves and take a squiz, but also there's an MSDN article and training on it as well. Okay, so I've already hit save on that, so let's just go back to my page here. And if we take a look in the SharePoint site, I've got this document library here with some documents in it, and we should be reaching back into that library and grabbing the list of them and just showing them on the page. So now if I refresh, now we've got, instead of blog posts, we've got the names of the documents from that host web application. So a lot of people get unstuck with this because they try to use the client context and they're like, none of my lists and libraries, when I try to use the client context that I'm passed, exist. And I can't seem to see the documents in my document library, or I can't see the lists I've got created. And they're using the client context for the app web, not for the host web. And so you have to jump through these hoops to jump back into your host web. And then all your lists and libraries will show up as you expect and so forth. Okay. Moving right along. I'm going to skip this next slide because we already talked about it. Bring Office documents into SharePoint apps with WAX. So WAX are the web applications for like Office, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, OneNote, so forth. And so what you could do is you can actually leverage these in your applications, in your SharePoint applications, to do previews of documents from inside SharePoint, for example. And so you can create a nice, rich experience with these embedded previews. If you've used SharePoint 2013 and you've used the search experience, when you get a list of document results and you mouse over it, you get a little panel that pops up. Or in a document library, you also get the same panel pop up. In fact, let's this guy over here. So when you pop up this panel, you'll get the little embedded web application that shows you a preview. You can use that same preview pane in your applications. And so I just wanted to show you how to do that. I think it's kind of nifty for apps that are document related. So let's jump on to default. I'm going to comment in an iframe called document viewer. That's where we're going to put that previewer. The way it works is it's an iframe that you point at a special URL, and you'll get back the preview for that document. So we need an iframe to put it in. Now in our app.js, let's go and do a couple of different things in the get documents. So instead of just outputting to a message to the page, let's comment that out and put this guy in. And what this guy does is constructs the URL for the document preview. And the real guts of it is this thing called the WAPI frame. Again, please don't ask me what WAPI stands for. I've got absolutely no idea, but it sounds kind of cool. And you pass it some parameters, like you pass it the name of the source document, your action, and that you want an embedded view. And then so I'm going to put out a series of links onto the page, and they're going to call a function called show preview JavaScript when they're called, and it's basically just going to redirect that iframe at that URL that we've constructed. And so the show preview just takes the URL, gets the document viewer iframe, and sets the source for it. So let's save that and start things off. See, waiting around like this is why you don't want to stop debugging SharePoint hosted apps. You just want them to start. Okay, we've got that. Come back. We'll let that do its thing. Don't fail me now, Visual Studio. Yes, you could have very well done it in Napa. So that's a good point. If people aren't familiar with what Napa is, it's a web-based development environment for SharePoint hosted apps. So you go and get your developer tenancy in Office 365. There's an app called Napa, N-A-P-A, and you can install that, and you get a pretty cool in-browser development environment for SharePoint apps. Let's give it another shot. And so it's just SharePoint apps, so you can just do HTML and JavaScript and so forth. Installing app, that's better. It's getting there. This is the little engine that could. Come on. If this one doesn't work, I'm going to move on and come back to it. Okay, here we go. So we've got our app. Yes, I want to trust it. It uninstalled and reinstalled the app. That's why we're getting that one. And now we've got this iframe at the bottom. This is just showing Microsoft.com's homepage. Now we've got links for our different documents, and if I click on them, you'll see our iframe is redirected, and we've got the inline preview. In this case, it's Word, but you can also do Excel. You can also do PowerPoint, I think, is this guy here, maybe? No. Yeah, that guy there. And so you can do pretty rich previews inline. There's a few different modes that you can use. You can also size it however you like and that sort of thing. Okay. Now, we're a little behind. So the next one is single-page apps in SharePoint. Who knows what a single-page app is, or a SPA? A few folks. So one of the cool things about the app model, the new app model that I like in SharePoint and Office is that finally SharePoint developers and Office developers can play with the cool kids. And by that I mean everything that's happening, all the cool kids are doing in the world around new web technologies and new back-end stuff and things like that, SharePoint developers can finally take advantage of. We've been stuck in the dark ages for years with things like no MVC and all the stuff that has been a royal pain to deal with. And so the new app model lets us take advantage of the things that Scott Goo gets up and announces that we don't have to be like, oh, well, that would be cool, 2 years we could use that. So now we can use it straight away because it's all just web technology. And one of the really interesting things is this new concept called single-page applications that have gained in popularity. It's really an entire application built in HTML and JavaScript running from a single page, strangely enough. So there's a couple of things to be aware of here. In the demo that I'm going to show, it's just a single SharePoint-hosted page, application page. I use client-side scripting for everything. Communicates with SharePoint through the use of the client-side object model, the JavaScript object model. And it does things like integrates with the browser for nav so that when you hit back, it does the right thing and all that sort of stuff. John Papa is doing a talk, I think right now is on Knockout, and there's another one earlier in the week, I think, on building SPA apps. So I'm not going to go into great detail on this. I've been very kindly donated this demo by a guy called Andrew Connell, who wrote this SPA app for the demo that I do a bunch of work with him, and we're good friends, and he kindly donated what we're about to see. So he blogs a lot about this as well, and he's kind of like the guy that's been pioneering this stuff for SharePoint. If you want to learn more, then johnpapa.net/SPA is a good place to start. Also, if you've got a Pluralsight subscription, John Papa posts a ton of training on SPA up to Pluralsight. And then down the left are the frameworks that you'll see, or that if you dig into the demo bits that are available off AC's blog, andrewconnell.com, you'll see the frameworks that are being used in this app. So Durandal, Knockout, Bootstrap, Font Awesome, which is just ludicrously cool. Link.js for doing link-style queries in JavaScript. Toaster for doing these little toast notifications and so forth. So let's take a look at it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all of the code for how this works because we're running a little short on that time. But all of these bits are available, so you can dig in and take a look at it in more detail. So let's take a look at the app first. And for that, I'll go back to my SharePoint site. I've already installed this app. It's called the Learning Path app, I believe. Here we go. So I'll go find that. Learning Path Manager app, there we go. And now when I click it, this is a SharePoint hosted app. There's no Azure backend. All it is a single HTML page and some JavaScript. So I go launch that, you'll see the typical Chrome and that sort of thing. And now you see some UI. And so this is again, it's using Durandal for MVVM framework, Knockout for doing data binding into HTML from JavaScript and so forth, Bootstrap for layout, Font Awesome for all of the little glyphs and images and that sort of thing that you see, Link.js for querying SharePoint data and dealing with the data that comes back, and Toaster for, if you noticed up on the top, you get that little toast notification pop up, that's Toaster. So what this guy does is basically displays and lets you interact with data that's stored in SharePoint lists. And in this case, there's learning paths and learning items. And learning items live within a learning path. So you can come in and create a new learning path. You can delete them and so forth. And you can come in and create new learning items. And so if I say, I want to create a new learning item that's like read AC's and John Papa's blog for more. And we say this is a blog post. We'll put it in my test learning path. I don't know, foo. And let's put andrewconnell.com. There we go. So that's where you go find information about this particular app and its source. And click Save. And in the background, what's happening there is it's gone, the JavaScript has taken that content and then used the JavaScript client-side object model to post that back into SharePoint. So it's a pretty nifty little app. Sorry, go ahead. So the critical and disappointing part of your question was you said people picker, and So you can get access to a lot of that information, but there isn't a reusable people picker control, unfortunately. Folks that are having to build quite complex apps that have people pickers and so forth are having to craft them themselves, unfortunately, at this stage. So let's go take a look at this app behind the covers. It's a SharePoint hosted app. There's really just one page in here. So if I go into the Pages folder, default.aspx is it. There's no code. There's not even any code behind for this page. Nothing. It loads the SharePoint JavaScript and so forth that it needs. It loads the CSS for the various different frameworks that I've got, like FontAwesome, Toaster, and Bootstrap. Then it loads all of these script libraries for all the SPA framework, for the different frameworks and helper things I'm using. And then core.js also gets loaded. And right down here at the end is the actual content on the page. And so this is real simple. This is just, you've got the header and this require.js is going to call and get this guy started using main.js. So if we go take a look at that, so scripts is where all the framework libraries sit. And if I go up into main.js and app, this is where the goods get started. So require.js it manages all of the dependencies between these different libraries and so forth, and helps you manage firing, loading things up on demand when you need them and so forth. So when it gets started, really the guts of this, a couple of pieces. Use convention for the router and the view locator. So this is basically how I get, if you're familiar with an MVVM framework, like Caliburn Micro or Caliburn or MVVM Lite and so forth. The guy who wrote Durandal, Rob Eisenhower, not Eisenhower, that's wrong. Anywho, he wrote Caliburn Micro and Caliburn, which use convention-based mapping, which is basically the name of your view model and the name of your view. If you name them right, they know about each other, and it automatically gets all wired up in the background. And so the last part here is saying set the root for this app, which is shell. And so that fires off the shell view and view model. And so in here you can see we've got shell.html, and that's using knockout to do some binding. And then in shell.js, this is the JavaScript for that, the view model for that view. Now the bit that I did want to touch on is getting data from SharePoint. So if you take a look in services, we've got this thing called the data service, which is really a helper library full of interesting functions for getting access to the different bits of data from SharePoint that we need. And if we take a look at get learning items, this is going to reach back into SharePoint and grab through the REST API those items. And so we've got a helper library called SP-AppUtils, and then the function called get app OData API URL. And then we're just building up the rest of the URL on top of that. Really, this guy just returns back a base URL for _API, which is where you'll find all the REST endpoints in SharePoint. And we're saying we want to get a web. In the web, we want to get some lists, get the title, learning items, and get the items for that list. Select these properties or these columns from the list. Expand this property and order by title. And then it's going to do, using jQuery to do an AJAX call back to SharePoint to go and get that. Now, the reason it's working is because that list is in the app web, not in the host web. So we don't have to do any cross-site stuff there. And then when it succeeds, it's going to parse out the data from it and return it back in our collection. If we go into odatautils.getRequest, let's go odatautils. Get request. This just sets up the request for us, adds the JSON header, sets the method type and so forth. And if we jump down, if you're doing posts and deletes and other things through the REST OM, then you need to be a little bit more sophisticated. You need to add the digest back to the post. So you grab that, that's given to you on the page, and so you can grab it using using jQuery in this request digest field, but you need to include that in your post backs for doing those things. So the data gets returned from the lists, bubbled right up, and shown through the, obviously in the UI there. For more information on this, I definitely recommend going and checking out Andrew Connell's blog for all of the download of the bits, and he's talking about those, talking about the demo in more detail about how it all sort of works under the covers. I think it's ludicrously cool because it's, it's using a framework and a set of techniques that a lot of other folks are using on the web today. I'm going to skip number 7 because it's not all that interesting in comparison to the next one. Number 7, I'll include the bits in the download for the session and so forth so you could take a look at it, but it's really all about using the Chrome control that SharePoint provides to brand your site and use the same styles that SharePoint uses and so forth. Okay, number 8 is, I'm going to go a couple minutes over because this is good. Elevate your SharePoint app permissions with app-only calls. So if you're used to writing full trust code, then you can elevate your permissions and do stuff that the currently running user shouldn't be able to do. And you can do similar sort of thing in the new app model with what's called an app-only call. So if we jump back into my basic SharePoint app here and take a look in the app manifest, first you need to say allow app-only call, app-only policy. You need that set to enable this stuff. Once you've done that, it's pretty straightforward. In your calling page, I've got one called app-only here. In the code behind, what's going to happen is I'm going to create, I get my current context, I create using the token helper and the method called getAppOnlyAccessToken. That's going to get me an app-specific token, and then I'm going to use the client context to go and do stuff. And in this case, I'm really just adding a new item to a list. Now, if we flip over to SharePoint and help explain what's going on here, if I take a look in the movies list, I've just got some movies here that I've added earlier on. And if I go into one and take a quick look, you could see that this was added by Chris Johnson. And so that was my user added this to the list. And so with app only, what happens is you're able to make a call back into SharePoint in only the context of the app and not in the user. And so, for example, if the user didn't have access to this list, then the app could still get access to it if the app has been given permissions to that list. And so let's take a look at this guy running. So let's go to app-only.aspx. I've got a box here. I type a name of a movie into, say Aliens. I click this button. That wasn't supposed to happen. I've had this happen twice in my demo environment. I'm going to move on. But what would happen is you'd see a new list item be added. For some reason, I believe because I'm debugging and retracting and deploying so often, that sometimes it gets a little out of whack, and I end up having to manually remove the app from SharePoint and then redeploy it to get this working again, but I don't want to waste the time doing that. So what we would have seen is a movie being added to SharePoint, to that list, and instead of saying by Chris Johnson, it will say by and then the name of the app instead. So it doesn't say my name, it just has the app name. So that's kind of cool if you need to do things like you would have done with elevating privileges in full trust code. As a good friend of mine, Kirk Evans, say, full trust code using elevated permissions is kind of like running in the dark with scissors, which I thought was just, I'm making it my own now. I love it. And in a similar vein, this gives apps access to things, but with just the permissions that they should have as an app, not as system, right? So there's still a level of security and so forth in there. Okay, sort of finishing up. Bring your app to where users are by integrating with Yammer. So what I'm going to do is follow up with a blog post on an app that I've written called Share It, which is not in the store just yet, in the SharePoint store, but it basically lets you share documents to places in Yammer. And so the point of this slide is to really say, take advantage of Yammer in your applications if organizations are using them. Post to the feed, post to the activity feed and so forth in Yammer. Use the Open Graph APIs and the message and REST APIs that are available in Yammer to do that. And so I have an example of one of these called Share It. And so let me just walk you I'll just have a quick, I'll show you what this looks like running. So I've already installed the app called Share It. What it does is in a document library, let's choose Contoso Sales Presentation. When you select it, the app adds a button to the ribbon called Post to Yammer. So you can see that button up in the ribbon there. What that does is it starts the Yammer OAuth flow. Yammer uses OAuth as well, much like SharePoint. So I can go and say to Yammer, hey, I want to authenticate with you through the OAuth flow and ask for permissions to post and so forth. Then I get that same sort of concept of a token back. Then I can use that token to post to the Yammer APIs, like to the REST APIs and the Open Graph APIs and so forth. So when I click Post to Yammer, it's going to go through that flow. I believe I've already logged into Yammer, so it won't prompt me, or it shouldn't prompt me if I've already logged in. And then it's going to post to the Yammer feed, and then I'm given a final confirmation just saying, hey, I've posted. And so then if I say, take me to Yammer, this is my demo Yammer tenancy. Yammer is awesome. And you can see here we've got posted this PowerPoint presentation to the Yammer feed. You'll also see it in the activity feed over on the right-hand side. The bits behind this is it's using the REST API to post to the main feed that you see down the middle, and the Open Graph API that Yammer supports to post to the activity feed down the right-hand side. And so this is a really nice way, similar to how Monitor was showing debug and trace information. If there are users doing things in your application that they want to share with others, then it's a really nice way to sort of promote that and post it into Yammer to have people keep up to date with what that person's working on and so forth. They can follow that post and that sort of thing. Again, I'll follow up with a blog post with the full source for this. It's a bit more of a comprehensive project. I won't walk through it now because we're well over time. Okay. Let me jump forward to here. Related content. Like I mentioned, if you haven't seen the 0 to 60 developing apps for SharePoint, there's also one for Office as well, or 2 different sessions. That's a real good baseline session to start with. John Papa's single-page applications with Microsoft ASP.NET, really, really good session to go check out the recording from. It has all sorts of interesting stuff. I will be down in the Office booth from 12:30, it seems, and pretty much there for the afternoon if you want to talk about any of the demos that you've seen today. I'm sorry we ran out of time. I would have liked to have spent a bit more time on some of these demos and walk through a bit more of the code. But I will post all of the source on my blog on looselytyped.net probably within a week. So I'll write it up, each demo. I'll also put screen recordings of the demos that I've recorded in case I lost internet access, and post them all up to my blog. So I highly recommend going and taking a look at those. Please go fill out your evals, learn stuff, win stuff, and thank you all very much for coming. Thanks for staying a little over time. I hope you have an enjoyable trip home and you've had a great conference. Thanks very much.